A lonely widow helps a lost child. The words echoed in Margaret Wilson's mind as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. 57 years old, with streaks of silver painting through her once auburn hair, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The lines around her eyes had deepened this past year, carved by grief after Robert's sudden passing. Their modest two-bedroom home in Mapleton felt cavernous now, filled with shadows and memories that whispered through empty rooms. Outside her window, autumn painted the neighborhood in amber and gold. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, fighting the persistent chill that seemed to follow her these days. 28 years of marriage, dissolved into photo albums and a side of the bed that remained perpetually made. She forced herself through the motions of her morning routine. Coffee, toast she wouldn't eat, the local newspaper she'd scan without absorbing. Small rituals to anchor herself to a world that kept spinning despite her feeling stuck in place. One day at a time, she whispered, her therapist's mantra hanging in the air between her and the empty chair across the kitchen table. Her fingers traced the worn wood, polished smooth by decades of shared meals and conversations. The silence pressed against her eardrums. The neighborhood children's laughter drifted through her partially open window as they waited for the school bus at the corner. Margaret found herself drawn to the window, watching their carefree movements with a familiar ache blooming in her chest. A pain that had nothing to do with Robert, but rather with a decision made 30 years ago when she was barely more than a child herself. Some wounds time doesn't heal. It merely teaches you to carry them. The bus arrived, collecting its noisy cargo, and the street fell quiet again. Margaret grabbed her purse and keys. Volunteer work at the library kept her sane these days, gave her purpose when purpose was hard to find. As she locked her front door, the crisp October air nipped at her cheeks, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of the first frost. The library sat nestled between the town's only coffee shop and the municipal building, a sturdy brick structure with wide steps and tall windows that glowed amber in the afternoons. Inside, the familiar smell of books and lemon furniture polish wrapped around her like an old friend's embrace. "Morning, Margaret," called Elaine from behind the circulation desk, her silver-rimmed glasses perched precariously on her nose. New shipment came in. "Picture books for the children's section." Margaret nodded, grateful for the task. Children's books were her favorite, their bright illustrations and hopeful endings a balm to her worn spirit. She settled into the back room with the box, carefully pulling out each book, checking it against the order form, and affixing the library's label. Outside, the skies darkened, and rain began to tap against the windows. Margaret worked methodically through the lunch hour, losing herself in the simple, repetitive task. By mid-afternoon, the downpour had intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. It was during a particularly fierce burst of wind that the library door swung open, the bell above it jingling wildly. Margaret looked up from her cart of books to see a small figure stumble inside, dripping water onto the worn carpet. A boy, no more than 10 years old, soaked through and shivering. His dark hair plastered against his forehead, water streaming from his navy blue jacket. "Oh my goodness," Elaine exclaimed, rounding the desk. "You're drenched, young man." The boy's eyes darted around the library, wide and uncertain. His lower lip trembled slightly. I got lost," he managed, his voice small against the percussion of rain. Margaret felt herself moving forward before she'd made the conscious decision to do so. Something about the boy, perhaps the tremble in his voice or the way his shoulders hunched forward protectively, tugged at a long dormant part of her heart. "Let's get you dried off," she said gently, approaching slowly as one might a startled animal. "I'm Margaret." The boy looked up at her, water dripping from his eyelashes. Dark brown eyes that seemed somehow familiar met hers. "I'm James," he replied, a slight stutter in his words. "I was supposed to meet my foster mom at the park, but then it started raining and I tried to find my way to her work, but I don't know where it is exactly." Foster mom. The words registered with a small pang in Margaret's chest. "Well, James, you're safe now?" she said, slipping off her cardigan and draping it around his shoulders. It engulfed his small frame. "Let's call your foster mother and let her know where you are." "She must be worried sick." The boy nodded, relief washing over his features. Margaret guided him to the staff room, where a small space heater hummed in the corner. She grabbed the box of tissues from the table and gently dabbed at his face, her touch instinctively maternal. Do you have kids?" James asked suddenly, his eyes studying her face with a directness that caught her off guard. The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of emotion spreading outward. Margaret's hands stilled for just a moment. "No," she said softly, the familiar lie bitter on her tongue. "No, I don't. You'd be good at it," he said simply, with the unfiltered honesty that only children possess. "You're nice like Mrs. Abernathy at school. She always knows when someone's having a bad day." A smile tugged at Margaret's lips despite the ache in her chest. "That's quite a compliment. Now let's call your foster mother. What's her name?" "Ms. Claire." "Claire Donovan," James replied, fishing a soggy piece of paper from his pocket with a phone number scrawled on it. "She gave me this for emergencies." Margaret dialed the number on the staff phone, her eyes never leaving the boy who sat huddled in her cardigan, his small feet dangling above the floor. There was something in his mannerisms, the way he tilted his head slightly when thinking, how his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tissue, that struck a chord of déjà vu. After a brief conversation with a clearly frantic Claire Donovan, Margaret hung up with assurance that the woman would arrive within 20 minutes. She had been searching the park and surrounding areas in a panic. "She's on her way," Margaret told James, who nodded with visible relief. "She's very glad you're safe. How about some hot chocolate while we wait?" The boy's face brightened instantly. "Yes, please." As she prepared the drink in the small staff kitchenette, Margaret felt an unexpected lightness in her movements. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of loneliness had lifted, if only temporarily. She watched as James carefully blew on his hot chocolate, creating ripples across the surface. "My mom used to make hot chocolate when it rained," he said suddenly, staring into his mug. "My real mom, I mean. At least I think she did. Sometimes I'm not sure if I remember her or if I just made it up." Margaret's heart stuttered. "How long have you been in foster care, James?" "Since I was 5, he replied, matter-of-factly, the way children do when stating painful truths they've come to accept. "My mom couldn't take care of me anymore. That's what they told me." The familiar guilt rose like floodwater in Margaret's chest. 30 years ago, she had been 19, unmarried, terrified. A baby she couldn't keep. A decision that haunted quiet moments like these. "Sometimes," Margaret said carefully, choosing her words, "moms have to make very hard choices. It doesn't mean they don't love their children." James looked up at her, those dark eyes suddenly piercing. "Did you know someone who had to give away their baby?" The question hung in the air between them, innocent yet devastating in its precision. Before Margaret could formulate a response, the library door's bell jingled again, and hurried footsteps approached the staff room. "James!" A woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and rain-speckled glasses appeared in the doorway, relief flooding her features. "Thank goodness, Ms. Claire!" James set down his mug and ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. The woman embraced him tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of his still damp head. "You scared me half to death," she said, though there was no anger in her voice, only relieved exhaustion. She looked up at Margaret with grateful eyes. "Thank you so much for taking care of him. I've been out of my mind with worry. He's a wonderful boy," Margaret said, surprised by the thickness in her voice. "It was my pleasure." As Claire helped James into a dry jacket she'd brought, Margaret retrieved her cardigan, now slightly damp from the boy's clothes. She folded it carefully, trying to ignore the strange reluctance she felt to see him go. "Wait," James said suddenly, turning back to Margaret. "Can I come back sometime? To read the new picture books?" Before Claire could answer, Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "The library's open every day except Sundays, and I'm always here on weekday afternoons. We can definitely arrange that," Claire agreed with a warm look toward Margaret. "James loves to read. It's hard to keep him supplied with enough books." As they prepared to leave, James turned back one last time. "Thank you for the hot chocolate, Ms. Margaret, and for not making me feel scared about being lost." With that, they were gone, the library door closing behind them with a gentle jingle. Margaret stood motionless, one hand pressed against her cardigan, where the lingering warmth from James's small body was already fading. That night, Margaret slept without the aid of the sleeping pills that had become her nightly companion since Robert's death. Her dreams were filled with fragments: a baby's cry, a hospital room, papers signed with trembling hands, and a pair of dark brown eyes that seemed to look straight through her. The following Tuesday, Margaret was shelving new arrivals when she heard the now familiar jingle of the door, followed by a voice that made her heart leap unexpectedly. "Ms. Margaret." We came back like we promised. James bounded toward her, a backpack bouncing against his shoulders, Claire following with an apologetic smile. I hope we're not interrupting, the foster mother said. He's been asking every day when we could return. Not at all, Margaret replied, warmth spreading through her chest at the sight of the boy's eager face. I was hoping you'd come back. For the next hour, Margaret showed James her favorite corner of the children's section, a window seat lined with cushions where sunlight spilled across the pages of whatever book was being read. He settled there immediately, as if he'd been visiting this spot his entire life, while Claire browsed the adult fiction nearby. This one, James declared, holding up a book about a lighthouse keeper who rescues sea creatures. This is the best one. Margaret sat beside him, their shoulders touching lightly as he opened the book. Shall I read it to you? James nodded, leaning slightly against her as she began to read. The simple act of reading aloud to a child, something she'd done hundreds of times for library patrons, felt profoundly different with this boy. Each word seemed to weave an invisible thread between them. Their library visits became a weekly ritual. Every Tuesday after school, Claire would bring James, sometimes staying to browse, other times running errands while Margaret kept an eye on him. The library staff grew accustomed to the sound of his laughter, to the sight of him trailing after Margaret as she worked, asking endless questions about books and the world. He's quite attached to you, Claire commented one November afternoon as they watched James arranging plastic dinosaurs in a prehistoric diorama Margaret had helped him set up in the children's area. He talks about you all the time at home. Margaret's chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. He's a special boy. Claire nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her features. He's had a difficult time in the system. His birth mother gave him up when he was just a baby, and he was adopted by a couple in their 50s. They gave him a good home, but they both passed away in a car accident when he was 5. He's been in foster care since then. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, the parallel to her own life, losing Robert suddenly, striking her forcefully. That's terrible, she whispered. No wonder he seems old for his age sometimes. He's remarkably resilient, Claire agreed. But he's always searching, I think. For connection, for permanence. She hesitated, glancing at Margaret. Would you ever consider becoming a library mentor for him? It's a program for foster children, meeting once a week for reading and activities. Given how he's responded to you already, I think it would be wonderful for him. The question caught Margaret off guard, a sudden expansion of what had been a casual, if meaningful, connection. But looking at James, his small face serious as he positioned a triceratops just so, she found herself nodding. I'd be honored, she said softly. As autumn deepened toward winter, their Tuesday visits expanded to include Saturday mornings as well. The formal mentorship program provided structure, but Margaret found herself going beyond its requirements, helping James with homework, listening to his stories about school, and even taking him, with Claire's permission, to the small natural history museum in the next town over. They developed small rituals: hot chocolate on rainy days, sharing the window seat with a new book, walks through the park to collect interesting leaves and stones. Margaret began keeping a drawer at home filled with things she thought might interest him: an unusual feather, a book about space, a smooth stone polished by the river. One Saturday in early December, as they walked through the town square where holiday decorations were being installed, James's small hand slipped into hers. Margaret felt her breath catch, the simple gesture unlocking something tightly bound within her. Ms. Margaret? James asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Can I ask you something important? Of course, she replied, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Why do you look sad sometimes when you think no one's watching? The question, so direct and perceptive, stopped her mid-step. Margaret looked down at him, at those thoughtful brown eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed composure. Everyone gets sad sometimes, James, she said carefully. He shook his head, unconvinced. It's a different kind of sad, like you lost something really important. The winter air suddenly seemed insufficient for breathing. Margaret guided them to a bench, brushing away a few stray snowflakes before they sat. How to explain grief and regret to a 10-year-old? How to speak of the two great losses of her life, one to death, one to her own decision. I did lose something important, she admitted finally. My husband Robert died last year, and ... She hesitated, treading carefully. A long time ago, I had to make a very difficult choice that still makes me sad sometimes. James leaned against her, his warmth a contrast to the December chill. Was it like my first mom? Did you have to give someone up? Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The perceptiveness of this child continually startled her. Yes, she whispered, the first time she'd acknowledged it aloud to anyone in years. I was very young and I couldn't take care of a baby. I thought someone else could give him a better life than I could. James nodded solemnly, processing this information with surprising maturity. Do you ever wonder where he is? If he's okay? Every day, Margaret admitted, her voice catching. Every single day. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the town's Christmas tree was slowly raised in the center of the square, workers calling directions to each other as they secured it in place. I think, James said finally, his eyes on the tree, that wherever he is, he'd be glad to know you. Like I am. Margaret couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she wrapped an arm around his small shoulders and held him close as the first string of lights illuminated on the tree, tiny stars against the darkening afternoon sky. The holiday season intensified both Margaret's grief and her growing attachment to James. As Christmas approached, she found herself buying him small gifts, a model rocket kit, a compass, books she thought he'd enjoy. She wrapped each one carefully, with more attention than she'd given to any task in the past year. Claire noticed the change in her. You seem different, she commented one afternoon when she came to pick James up from the library. There's a light back in your eyes. Margaret smiled, watching as James carefully returned books to their proper places on the shelves, a habit she'd instilled in him. He's given me something to look forward to, she admitted. I didn't realize how much I needed that. It goes both ways, Claire assured her. He's blossomed since meeting you. His teachers have noticed too. She hesitated, then added, I'm not supposed to say anything yet, but there's a family interested in adopting James. They're wonderful people. He'd have stability, siblings, everything we've hoped for him. The news should have brought Margaret nothing but joy. Instead, she felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. That's wonderful, she managed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When would this happen? Nothing's certain yet, Claire cautioned. The process takes time, but possibly by spring. Spring? Just a few months away? Margaret nodded, forcing enthusiasm into her voice as she asked appropriate questions about the potential family. But inside, a voice whispered, You're losing him too. That night, Margaret pulled out the small wooden box she kept at the back of her closet. Inside lay the few mementos she'd allowed herself to keep: a hospital bracelet, a single Polaroid of a newborn with dark hair, and a baby blanket, blue with yellow stars, now faded with age. Her son would be 30 now. A man, not a child. Perhaps with children of his own. The fantasy she sometimes indulged, of a reunion, of forgiveness, seemed suddenly hollow in the face of her attachment to James. She was transferring her maternal feelings, her therapist would say, trying to fill one void with another connection. But knowing this didn't diminish what she felt for the boy who had wandered into her life on a rainy October afternoon. The week before Christmas, a snowstorm descended on Mapleton, closing schools and the library. Margaret worried about James, knowing that Claire's small apartment could feel confining during bad weather. On impulse, she called to invite them both for dinner. Actually, Claire said, sounding relieved, I was going to call you. My sister's in the hospital in Albany. Nothing serious, but I should be with her. I've been trying to find someone to watch James for the weekend. The agency has backup care, but... Say no more, Margaret interrupted. He can stay with me. I have the guest room already. By that evening, James was settled into Robert's old armchair, a cup of hot chocolate balanced on the side table, watching the snow swirl past the windows with fascination. Margaret moved around the kitchen, preparing a dinner more elaborate than anything she'd cooked since Robert's death. Can we build a snowman tomorrow? James called, his socked feet dangling above the floor. If the storm lets up, absolutely, Margaret replied, feeling more centered, more present than she had in months. Later, after they'd eaten and played 2 games of checkers, James winning both, Margaret showed him to the guest room. I put extra blankets at the foot of the bed in case you get cold, she told him, turning down the quilt. And there's a nightlight in the bathroom just across the hall. James sat on the edge of the bed, bouncing slightly to test its firmness. This is nice, he said, glancing around the room with its blue walls and nautical decor. Robert's choice from years ago. Did your son stay here when he visited? The question knocked the air from Margaret's lungs. What? James looked up at her, those familiar brown eyes suddenly serious. The boy you had to give up. He'd be grown up now, right? Does he visit you? Margaret sank slowly onto the bed beside him, her legs suddenly unsteady. No, James. He doesn't visit. He ... He doesn't know where I am. Oh. James considered this, his brow furrowing. Didn't you try to find him? The direct, innocent questions pierced straight through the careful walls Margaret had built around this part of her life. It's complicated, she said finally. When I gave him up for adoption, it was what they called a closed adoption. I don't know who adopted him, and he doesn't have my information either. But now you could find him, right? With computers and stuff? Margaret brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. Maybe. But sometimes opening old wounds can be painful. And what if he doesn't want to know me? What if he's angry that I gave him up? James leaned against her, his small body warm against her side. I think he'd want to know you, he said with conviction. You're the best person I know. That night, after James had fallen asleep, Margaret sat at her computer, staring at the website for the adoption registry she'd looked at dozens of times before, but never had the courage to join. Her son would be 30 in February. 30 years since she'd held him just once before the nurse had taken him away. With trembling fingers, she began to fill out the registration form. January brought a strange combination of hope and anxiety. Margaret checked the adoption registry daily, though she knew the chances of an immediate match were slim. Meanwhile, her relationship with James deepened, their weekend visits becoming the highlight of her week. Claire kept her updated on the potential adoption. The family, a professor and his wife with 2 daughters, had met James twice and were proceeding with the formal application. He likes them, Claire assured Margaret one frosty afternoon. But he's worried about what will happen with you if he moves to Boston. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. We'll stay in touch, she promised, though she wondered if his new family would gradually phase out the connections to his foster care past. It would be natural, healthy even, for him to fully integrate into his new family. In late January, James arrived at the library with a school project, a family tree assignment. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret as they sat together at a study table, looking at the mostly empty branches of the paper tree. Ms. Claire helped me put in what we know, James explained, pointing to the few filled spaces. My adoptive parents here and their parents here? But there's nothing on this side. His finger traced the empty branches where his birth parents should be. That's often the case with adoption, Margaret said gently. But family isn't just about blood relations. Look at all these people who care about you. She pointed to the spaces Claire had helped him fill with foster siblings, teachers, and caregivers who had been part of his life. I put you here, James said, pointing to a carefully written MS. Margaret, near the bottom of the tree. He'd drawn a small book next to her name. Margaret blinked back sudden tears. I'm honored, she said softly. Ms. Claire says my birth mom's name was Elizabeth, James continued, staring at the empty maternal branch. But we don't know anything else about her. Elizabeth, Margaret's middle name, which she'd given on the hospital records when her son was born. She'd been using her first name, Margaret, ever since college, a small attempt to separate her adult life from the teenage girl who'd made the most difficult decision of her life. Her heart began to pound so loudly she was certain James must hear it. James, she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, when is your birthday? February 15th. He replied, still focused on his project. I'll be 11 this year. Not 30, as her son would be turning, but 11. The timelines didn't match. Of course they didn't. What had she been thinking? Yet something kept her questioning. And you were born here in Mapleton? James shook his head. No, somewhere called Pine Ridge. That's where my first parents adopted me from. Pine Ridge Hospital, where Margaret had given birth 30 years ago. James, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, do you have a birth certificate? With your birth mother's information? He looked up, confused by her intensity. I think Ms. Claire has all my papers. Why? Just curious, Margaret managed, though her mind was racing, making connections that seemed impossible, yet increasingly plausible. The familiar eyes, the mannerisms, the immediate connection she'd felt. That evening, she called Claire with shaking hands. It's probably nothing, she began, but I need to ask you something important about James's background. Claire sounded puzzled but willing to help. What do you want to know? His birth mother. Was her full name Elizabeth Margaret Winters? Her maiden name, before she'd married Robert and become Elizabeth Margaret Wilson. A long pause followed. I'd have to check his file, Claire said slowly. But that sounds right. Margaret was definitely the middle name. How did you know that? Margaret closed her eyes, her free hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for support. Claire, I need to see his birth certificate. As soon as possible. Margaret, what's going on? Claire's voice sharpened with concern. You're scaring me a little. I think... Margaret took a deep breath, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. I think James might be my grandson. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of shock, disbelief, and frantic research. Claire brought James's file to Margaret's house the following morning, her face taut with concern and confusion. Together they spread the documents across Margaret's dining room table: birth certificate, adoption records, medical history. Elizabeth Margaret Winters, age 19. Birth date, February 15th, 30 years ago. Pine Ridge Hospital. This is impossible, Margaret whispered, tracing her finger over her daughter's name. My son was adopted by an older couple. They died when he was 5. Her voice trailed off as the parallels became unmistakable. Claire sat heavily in a chair. Are you saying you're James's grandmother? That you gave up his father for adoption? Margaret nodded, unable to speak as the full implications washed over her. Her son, the baby she'd given up, had grown up, had a child of his own, then died tragically. And now that child, her grandson, had wandered into her library on a rainy day, completing a circle she never could have imagined. We need a DNA test to be certain, Claire said practically, though her voice was unsteady. But the coincidence would be too extraordinary otherwise. Does James know any of this? About his father's adoption? Claire shook her head. Only that his father was adopted as an infant. The grandparents, your son's adoptive parents, never shared detailed information about his birth parents. They were from the generation that believed in keeping adoptions quiet. Margaret pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to process the cascade of revelations. Her son had lived and died without ever knowing who she was. But his son, her grandson, had found his way to her through what could only be described as fate. What do we tell James? She asked finally, looking up at Claire with red-rimmed eyes. The truth, Claire said gently. But first, let's be absolutely certain. The DNA test results, expedited through the foster care system's resources, arrived 10 days later, confirming what Margaret had already known in her heart. James was her biological grandson, the son of the baby boy she had given up 3 decades earlier. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, with social workers present for support, Margaret and Claire sat James down in Margaret's living room to explain the extraordinary connection they had discovered. Remember how we talked about your birth mother, Elizabeth? Claire began gently. James nodded, his eyes darting between the adults, sensing the weight of the moment. Well, Elizabeth had a mother too, your grandmother, Claire continued. And sometimes life works in amazing, unexpected ways. Margaret reached for James's hand, her own trembling slightly. James, I'm your grandmother. Elizabeth was my daughter. The boy's eyes widened, his mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. But you said you gave up a son, not a daughter. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I'm so sorry for the confusion. Elizabeth was my daughter whom I raised. She had a brother, my son, whom I gave up for adoption when I was very young. Your mother was my daughter, which makes me your maternal grandmother. James sat perfectly still, processing this information with the serious concentration she'd come to know so well. So that's why I felt like I knew you, he said finally, his voice filled with wonder. That's why you seemed familiar. Perhaps, Margaret whispered. Some connections transcend everything else. Does this mean... James hesitated, hope and caution warring in his expression. Does this mean I belong with you now? The question pierced Margaret's heart. She looked to Claire and the social worker, who had been quietly observing. That's something we need to discuss carefully, the social worker explained. There's a process called kinship care that we sometimes arrange when biological family members are identified. But it takes time, and everyone needs to be sure it's the right decision. I want it to be you, James said firmly, looking directly at Margaret. I've been looking for you my whole life without even knowing it. Later that night, after James had gone to sleep in what was rapidly becoming his room rather than the guest room, Margaret sat in Robert's old chair, a photo album open on her lap. Pictures of Elizabeth growing up, the daughter she'd raised, who had followed in her youthful footsteps by becoming pregnant young, but who had chosen to keep her baby. Elizabeth had been 25 when she died in that car accident alongside her husband, leaving 5-year-old James orphaned. If only Margaret had known, had somehow connected the dots when she heard about the accident in the local news. But Elizabeth had taken her husband's surname, and Margaret had no reason to connect the tragedy to her estranged daughter. So many missed connections, so many parallel losses. Robert's death had left Margaret alone, just as she was trying to rebuild her life after Elizabeth's passing. And all the while, James had been moving through the foster system, eventually finding his way back to the grandmother he never knew he had. "You brought him back to me," Margaret whispered to the universe, to whatever force had orchestrated this impossible reunion. "Thank you." Spring arrived with new beginnings. The kinship care application had been approved, allowing James to live with Margaret while the more permanent guardianship process moved forward. The prospective adoptive family in Boston had been understanding, even sending James a card wishing him well in his new life with his grandmother. On a warm April afternoon, Margaret and James stood in the small-town cemetery, placing flowers on 3 graves: Robert's, Elizabeth's, and her husband Michael's. James knelt by his parents' headstones, arranging daffodils with careful precision. "Do you think they know?" he asked, looking up at Margaret. "That we found each other?" Margaret smiled. The grief that had once consumed her now transformed into something bittersweet but bearable. "I believe they do." As they walked home, James's hand secure in hers, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. A lonely widow helps a lost child. The simplest act of kindness had unraveled a 30-year-old knot of regret and loss, bringing healing neither could have found alone. That evening, as they planted new flowers in the garden boxes beneath the windows, James insisting on arranging the marigolds in perfect rows, Margaret watched her grandson with a heart full to bursting. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, catching her gaze. "About how sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it," she replied honestly, "and how important it is to recognize that chance when it comes." James nodded solemnly, wisdom beyond his years in his expression. "Like when I got lost in the rain and found you instead. Exactly like that," Margaret agreed, reaching out to brush a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Some people might call it coincidence. Others might call it fate. I call it finding home," James said simply, returning to his marigolds with determined focus. Margaret tilted her face to the spring sunshine, letting its warmth seep into her skin. The road ahead would have its challenges. Raising a 10-year-old boy at 57 wasn't what she'd planned for this chapter of her life. There would be forms to complete, legal hurdles to overcome, and the everyday complexities of helping a child heal from multiple losses. But for the first time in years, Margaret Wilson felt complete. The circle that had broken 30 years ago when she'd signed those adoption papers had somehow, miraculously, been made whole again. A lonely widow helps a lost child. Sometimes the simplest acts of kindness turn out to be the most profound acts of healing, not just for those we help, but for ourselves as well.